Hi, doing a review of Sorority Slaughter here, which is a super obscure, little known, independent kind of micro budget slasher film from the people at W.A.V.E Productions. That's the back of the case. I reviewed one of these films before from the W.A.V.E company, Fatal Delusion, about 6 months or so back, which I actually thought was quite decent for a micro budget film, but not quite the case with this one, Sorority Slaughter, as we'll get into as we go through the review. But to give you some basic information about the film to kick off with, this is a 1994 film, but the information on the Internet Movie Database I find does in some places contradict the info in the title and credit sequences on the actual film itself. But on the sort of title sequences for the film, it says it's co-directed by both Sal Longo and Gary Whitson. And this Sal Longo also stars in the film, playing the role of Hugo. It was followed by a 1996 sequel, also by the same production company. It came under the same banner. That's what the sequel looks like. I'm not going to be reviewing that, but yeah, it does have a sequel. One thing to say about it is that this particular version that I have just had a blank disc, but the sequel, for what it's worth, did come with a printed disc with cover art, so something to note there. In terms of special features, there's pretty much nothing to speak of. There's a couple of trailers, I think, on this package, but not the actual trailer for the film. It's for the film itself, and there is no chapter menu or anything like that, so it's very basic, very bare bones. Okay, then going into the story for this one, and to kick things off, we're introduced to an average middle-aged looking guy named Hugo, the aforementioned Sal Longo, who seems to be attempting to turn himself into some kind of immortal vampire type creature, or warlock or something like that. And to achieve this, he is dabbling in the occult, and in particular he's drawn to something called Radu, some sort of a god or devil of some kind. And he kills a woman to offer up as a sacrifice to this Radu, and sure enough, he seems to become immortal as a result of doing that. So he achieves his aims. Next, we're introduced to a bunch of sorority girls who are living close to Hugo in the same neighbourhood. After a run-in with the deranged Hugo, where he commits a minor assault against one of these girls, the rest of them decide to get their own back by threatening him with a gun. But doesn't quite go to plan, and somehow actually Hugo actually winds up getting shot during this kind of prank. And but due to his new powers, obviously he's now just a vampire type creature. He shakes off the attack, and the bullet wound doesn't really do much to hurt him, and much to the girl's surprise. And from this point on, he becomes obsessed with trying to track down the girls that pulled this prank on him and trying to kill them up, or kill them and then offer them up, I should say, as sacrifices to this Radu god that he's sort of now in debt to as a result of his new powers. So that's the story of it. I'm going to go into what I liked about it now, the positives, but I will say before we begin with that, it's not a very good film, so these are kind of few and far between, scraping the barrel to kind of come up with these. But the first one is that if you like kind of sleazy type films, there might be something for you here, with a bit of like softcore titillation. The female cast is made up of an attractive bunch. Popular low budget horror actress at the time, Tina Krause, hopefully I'm pronouncing that right. She's appeared in quite a few of these W.A.V.E production films in the mid-90s. She's a part of it and she looks really good, to be fair. Like I say, some titillation on display, though it is entirely restricted to kind of wet t-shirt style stuff, or you might maybe see girls from behind in the shower, but so in that sense it's not really that explicit, so that might be mildly disappointing to some people. It is quite tame. But the girls at least are nice to look at, so that can alleviate some of the boredom that you might otherwise have watching the film, which doesn't have much else to recommend it. And the next good point that I've got is that for what is in every sense a micro-budget film, it isn't too bad in terms of the gore. There was a plentiful amount of blood at least, and given the limitations they were probably working with, I think they make a decent fist of kind of making the kills at least acceptable. They're not good by any stretch of the imagination, they're quite repetitive, but there's at least a little bit of blood splashed about, to be fair, so it could be worse. And the final good point, if you can really classify this as a good point, is that they're a little bit dodgy at times. The picture quality, for the most part, considering it's a low-budget, micro-budget film, is actually quite good. At least when it's outside, it's good, nice and bright, fairly sharp picture quality. It is kind of letterboxed to some extent, which is a bit of a drag, but If you can get past that, the picture quality isn't too bad, and the sound quality is actually quite decent as well, which can sometimes be a problem with these lower budget films, but I don't remember it being a problem here, so in that regard they at least have adequate production value, so excuse me, not too bad there. Getting on to the negative points now, and there's quite a few of these. It is a pretty poor film, like I've said, and the main thing that I've got here is it's just a rather boring experience, with certain scenes just dragging on for far too long and that don't really contribute very much. For example, there's a scene early on with two girls kind of frolicking in a pool that really outstays it's a welcome. It just drags on for ages. And even worse than that, there's a separate scene where two characters, I think it's a male and a female character, are washing a car and kind of messing about with the water, getting each other wet, kind of getting a bit frisky with each other as they carry out the task of cleaning this car. But it goes on for an absolute dog's age, way too long. And just when you think it's mercifully over, two more girls join in and they kind of start the whole process over, but just with four of them, and they all start cleaning the car and messing about with the water and like getting each other wet and soaping each other down, that kind of thing. It just drags on forever. It's just way too long, and it feels like padding. It doesn't really add anything to the film. And lastly, the final thing that I've got in regards to this that I've made up on my notes here is that towards the end there's a really long-winded dream sequence that again doesn't really add anything and just kind of exists to kind of pad out the running time. And bizarrely, actually, due to this dream sequence, one of the characters actually dies twice. Once in reality and then once again later on in someone's dream sequence, so that was a bit weird. So that's the first bad point. The second bad point, and it's like I said, a decent effort is made to have ample blood on display when it comes to the deaths, but putting that aside, the kills are not very good. They're all very similar, and they quickly become boring. In fact, they're all pretty much identical, with the victim being kind of stabbed in the chest on a makeshift altar of a kind, as this Hugo tries to offer them up to this Radu god that I mentioned previously. A bit more variety would have certainly have helped, would have been much appreciated, but it's sadly lacking here. The only exception is towards the very beginning, when it's more of like a strangulation type death, like a choking, but even that has its issues in that it's really dragged out far too long, and it makes the killer look like a bit of a bungler in that he takes so long to finally subdue his victim. Excuse me. And I think I might have actually had a similar issue with Fatal Delusion that I mentioned before, that I previously reviewed, but with that I kind of flagged the deaths up as a positive thing more so, even though they might have been quite similar to this kind of long drawn out choking scene. But at least with the killer in that film, he kind of had a bit of a charm to him, and he was kind of a fun character, but that was sadly lacking here. This Hugo is not. That's not the case with Hugo. He's not a very good killer, so he can't really get away with as much as Fatal Delusion did in that regard. Next bad point then is that another problem with the murders, and this is quite a big problem, in fact a massive issue, is that there's this weird thing when the victims seem to see the killer and then they just scream and faint, which is really weird because he doesn't look like an intimidating man. There's no mask or costume. It looks very much like an ordinary guy, so he certainly wouldn't be someone to instill fear, but it comes across as really lame. They each do it in turn. They kind of see the killer and they just go into a fit of hysterics. They scream and they faint, and then they obviously easily dealt with by the killer at that point when they're unconscious, but it just comes across as bizarre and head scratching. The only thing that I can think of is that maybe he's supposed to be perhaps the killer is supposed to be taking the form of this Radu god while he's kind of in the killing mood, and maybe they're seeing this face of a devil or something like that, but the budget didn't stretch to it, so we the audience don't see what they're seeing. Perhaps maybe that was the idea behind it all, but I'm probably just making excuses for them now, and that's just me trying to justify it, but that's the only thing that I could think of, but it's really weird and it just comes across as super lame. And the last bad point that I've got is that not enough effort is made with the script and the story. It feels very threadbare in comparison to the aforementioned Fatal Delusion, which had a bit more going on in that regard. Sorry to keep comparing the two, but just because they're both from the same kind of studio that I kind of lumped them together. For example of what I mean here is that the intimidation prank with the gun that the girls played on the Hugo character to try and get revenge for that assault that I mentioned, you would think that would be like kind of a catalyst for the rest of the film's story, and it is, but so you would think it's like a pivotal moment in the film, but we don't even actually see it on camera. It's actually, which is really strange. You would think that would be, like I say, a major scene, but it's not even in the film, so we just kind of hear about it secondhand. So really strange decision there. And instead of seeing key moments like that, we instead get long-winded, padded out moments such as the water fight that I mentioned that just drags on forever and doesn't really add much. So some really strange choices in terms of what they included with the final product. So with that said, I'm going to get into my verdict, and as you can guess, it's not very good. It's a bottom of the barrel type film. Unless you're a slasher completionist, then maybe give it a go in that sense, just to have it in your collection, but otherwise it's really not worth it. There's no redeeming qualities to it really. I was really struggling to find some positives to speak of earlier, but there's many issues like I've gone into: the threadbare story, the weird thing with the female screaming before they see the killer, and then or as they see the killer and then kind of fainting, which is crazy. Really spoils it. But chiefly just the lack of effort throughout the whole production in terms of the script really hurts it as well. There are some decent softcore TNA scenes that might kind of appeal to some, but even these are pretty tame by comparison to what you might see in other films, so I don't think even that would really save it. So with that said, I'm going to have to bring in my out of 10 verdict, and it's going to be, unfortunately, a very, very low 1 out of 10. It does seem harsh, and it is a micro-budget film, so you've got to take that into account, but even doing that, I still can't give it higher than a 1. It is a high 1, to be fair. It's only just missing out on a low 2, but I'm going to have to go with a 1, as harsh as that might sound. What I would say, like I said, is the sequel is a little bit better, I thought. Not by much. I'm not going to review this one, but if I was to review that, I'd probably give it a high 2, even a low 3 if being generous. It's decent at the beginning and at the end, kind of padded out with a long, boring middle section that quickly outstays its welcome and becomes repetitive, but slightly better in terms of story and acting, I thought that one. So that wouldn't be a 1, but unfortunately the actual original one here is a 1. For me, at least. Anyway, so I didn't think much of it. I'll put a kill count down in the description, so feel free to check that out, but obviously it will contain spoilers. Alright then, thanks for watching, bye.